Did your family have favorites? If so, were you the favorite or someone else?
Thanksgiving in my family has always been a strange performance, more like a stage play than a holiday, with my dad setting the tone as the director and everyone else falling into their assigned roles. My younger sister, Rachel, was always the golden one, the one who could do no wrong, and I, somehow, was cast as the shadow. I had gotten used to it over the years, or at least I thought I had, but nothing really prepares you for the moment when your father takes the role he's been playing your whole life and turns it into something permanent, something written down, stamped, and legally binding. We were sitting around the dining table, plates half full, conversations about nothing important buzzing around, when my dad cleared his throat in that way he does when he wants everyone's attention. The room went quiet, forks stopped clinking, and he reached under his chair for a folder. I didn't think much of it at first, maybe some new business deal he wanted to brag about or some old war story he planned to show off with documents and pictures. But then he slid the papers across the table, right in front of Rachel, with this little smirk tugging at his mouth. "She'll carry the family name," he said, loud enough for the entire table to hear, like he was announcing a royal coronation. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there while Rachel's eyes went wide and she tried to look modest even though she was practically glowing. My dad looked at me directly, his face twisted with that smug expression that I know too well, the same one he used when he told me years ago that helping me pay for college would be a waste since Rachel had more potential. He wanted me to see this, to feel it. He wanted me to sit there and absorb the humiliation, like it was just another Thanksgiving tradition. And for a moment, I did feel that old sting, that crushing reminder that no matter what I had achieved, no matter how hard I had worked, in his eyes I would always be less than her. But the thing is, I wasn't the same girl I used to be. I had learned to play a longer game, and in that instant, as everyone else was congratulating Rachel and raising glasses, I kept my hands folded in my lap and my face calm. I didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't ask him why or how. I didn't need to. Because the truth is, I had been waiting for this exact moment for years, planning for it in ways he never even suspected. While Rachel was gushing about how honored she felt, pretending to be overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing the property that had supposedly been in the family for generations, I kept my focus on Dad. I watched him watching me, his smirk widening when he saw I wasn't celebrating with them. He thought he had broken me again. He thought I was swallowing the same bitter pill I had been forced to take 100 times before. What he didn't realize was that this time, the pill didn't go down, and the game was no longer his to control. The rest of the evening felt like white noise, everyone laughing and clinking glasses, Rachel basking in her victory, and Dad sitting back with that satisfied grin like a king who had just handed his crown to his chosen heir. But underneath all that, my mind was calm, almost unnervingly so, because while they thought the night was about Rachel inheriting everything that mattered, I knew it was about something much bigger. I had a document of my own, and unlike the one Dad had slid across the table, mine wasn't a gesture of favoritism or tradition. Mine was strategy, pure and calculated, something I had crafted piece by piece while they weren't paying attention. So when he looked at me again, just before dessert was served, giving me that condescending smile like he had already decided my worth and sealed my fate, I smiled back, a small smile, the kind that says, "You don't even know what's coming." And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter at the table. I felt like the one holding the real power. I didn't say anything that night. I didn't need to. Silence was stronger than any words I could have thrown at him. And as the evening wrapped up, as Rachel carefully folded her property papers and Dad toasted her future, I simply thought to myself, this is exactly what I've been waiting for. And the moment he thinks he's beaten me is the moment I finally get to show him that he has no idea what game we're really playing. Because when the time comes, and it will, the papers he handed Rachel will mean nothing next to the document I'll slide across the table. And the smirk he wore that night will be the last one he ever dares to throw in my direction. When I say I grew up invisible, I don't mean that no one saw me sitting at the table or heard me speak. I mean that whenever the topic of pride or legacy or who deserved support came up, My name slid off the conversation like it had no weight, while Rachel's name settled in the middle of it and stayed there, and over time that does something to you because you learn to measure every moment not by whether it is fair, but by whether you can live with it and still move forward, and I learned to move forward even when my dad pretended not to notice. It started long before college, when the way he handed out praise looked a lot like a bonus plan at a company where everyone knows the favorites have already been chosen. So when I won a regional debate tournament, he said public speaking was a cute hobby and reminded me that Rachel had a state gymnastics meet coming up. And when I landed a scholarship that covered tuition for the first year, he told me it was good I had learned to fend for myself, because the world wasn't going to hold my hand. And then he cut a check for Rachel's apartment and groceries because according to him she needed stability to focus on her potential. So I learned to keep my head down, to work through weekends, to take shifts other people didn't want, and to stop expecting him to connect the dots between effort and support. What people on the outside never understand is that favoritism isn't loud most of the time. It's quiet and constant and defended with tidy little phrases like tradition or family expectations. And when I got my first real job in operations at a mid-sized firm and started learning how contracts actually work in the real world, how collateral is not romance, and how signatures are not hugs, and how filings have a memory that outlasts feelings, I found a calm that I had never felt before, because I realized that I was allowed to create my own rules so long as I understood everyone else's rules well enough to make them serve me when it counted. Around that time, my dad's business hit a rough patch that he tried to spin as a temporary cash hiccup, contractors threatening to walk, a note maturing at a lousy moment, and for once he called me, not Rachel, and asked if I could help him bridge a gap for a month or two until receivables cleared. And I remember the long pause before I answered, because I wanted to know if he heard his own voice asking for help from the daughter he called independent to justify leaving her out, and I said yes. But only if we did it by the book, and I meant it. So I wrote a check that stopped the bleeding, and I put in front of him a plain promise documented in language I could explain to any adult in the country without blushing. And he signed it so quickly I wondered if he even read it, and if he did read it I wondered if he would remember that paper when he felt like reminding me of my place later. Years passed, and I kept my mouth shut as he returned to old habits, praising Rachel for being a natural leader when she chaired a volunteer committee that met once a month, while treating my promotions like administrative housekeeping. But I stopped feeling angry in the way I used to because anger is expensive and planning is not, and I kept copies of everything that mattered. I kept receipts and emails and acknowledgement letters. I kept confirmations from registries that do not forget. And I learned exactly where and how to speak when someone tries to pretend something never happened, because people may dismiss you at a table when you do not demand attention, yet offices that stamp documents do not care who smiles or smirks. So when he slid the property papers to Rachel at Thanksgiving and spoke that line about her carrying the family name, I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, and then I felt it cool just as quickly. Not because I forgave him in that moment, but because I finally understood that I did not need him to recognize me for the record to recognize me, and while everyone around us drank to his version of legacy, I opened my phone under the table and typed a short, steady note to the attorney who helped me years ago, attaching scans I had stored in 3 different places, asking her to proceed with the next step we had discussed if, and when my dad tried exactly this move. And by the time dessert hit the table and Rachel was practicing her serious face speech about stewardship and tradition, a time-stamped message had landed in the right inboxes. A calendar alert had pinged the title officer we had spoken to in advance, and a hold was quietly placed on anything that touched that parcel until a certain agreement that bore a familiar signature was satisfied. I did not raise my voice, I did not storm out, and I did not make a scene, because scenes are for people who want attention, and I wanted leverage. And as I watched the night play out, I realized that the revenge I once imagined as a dramatic showdown did not need to be noisy to be real. It only needed to be precise. So I let the table think I was the same old me while the first piece of my plan clicked into place far from their laughter, and the satisfaction that washed over me was not cruel so much as clean, like the sound of a door locking behind you when you finally step into your own space. And here is the part that would make him furious if he had heard it in that moment. The part one whispered to myself while Rachel folded her glossy new papers and Dad lifted his glass for one more toast to tradition, that the last time he needed me. When I wrote that check and required a signature without an eye roll, I did not hand him a favor. I handed him a contract that grew teeth when he chose to forget me again, and tonight those teeth had already closed, and he just didn't know it yet. People sometimes assume that revenge, or whatever you want to call the kind of justice that finally levels a field after years of being walked over, is a single dramatic moment where someone flips a table or shouts out all the things they've been holding in. But what they don't realize is that the only way to really win against people who are used to holding power over you is to prepare long before the insult arrives. And that is exactly what I did, because I had stopped waiting for fairness. And instead built a system around myself where I would not need his approval, his praise, or his willingness to treat me like an equal in order to come out ahead when the time came. I started by listening more than I spoke, which is a skill people dismiss as weakness, but is actually the sharpest weapon if you know how to use it, and over time I picked up every detail about how my dad managed property, how he structured ownership, and how often he cut corners because he assumed the world would always defer to him, and I noticed that he repeated patterns, using the same lawyer friends for every transaction, the same backslapping style of management, the same casual arrogance that made him believe no one would ever bother double-checking his shortcuts, and I filed every bit of that away. When Rachel was out partying or shopping with friends and my dad was convinced I was too busy with work to notice, I was quietly learning, asking questions to colleagues who actually understood real estate law, and building a picture of what my dad valued most. Not because I wanted to inherit it, but because I knew he would try to use it to humiliate me again someday, and I refused to be caught off guard. One of the first moves I made was almost invisible. I invested in myself by building relationships with people who cared less about family drama and more about facts on paper. People who would take my call not because of my last name, but because I showed up prepared and knew exactly what I was asking for. I started small, asking about how liens work, about what happens when debts are tied to property, about how long records stay active in county offices even when someone thinks they've been buried under new paperwork. And every answer made me more certain that the only way to win in a family where favoritism ruled was to step out of the emotional noise and master the practical rules that actually stick. I kept my finances separate and clean, which was another point of pride for me, because my dad loved to act like independence was a punishment he had imposed on me, when in truth it became the biggest advantage I had, since every paycheck I earned, every investment I made, and every contract I signed bore my name alone without his influence touching it, and over time I built a cushion that gave me the freedom to make moves without asking anyone's permission. That freedom was the soil in which my plan grew, and every time he smirked or brushed me aside, I felt less anger and more confirmation that I was right to keep going. By the time Thanksgiving came around, I had already secured agreements with attorneys, title officers, and financial advisors who knew exactly what strings to pull if and when I gave the word, because we had mapped it all out in advance, walking through scenarios where my dad tried to transfer assets without regard for his earlier obligations, and in those scenarios I always came out holding the stronger card, not because I wanted to strip him of everything, but because I refused to let him strip me of my dignity one more time. It might sound calculated to the point of coldness, but I can tell you there was nothing cold about the years it took to get here, nothing unemotional about pretending to nod along when my dad called Rachel his pride and joy. Nothing easy about smiling at family dinners while quietly filing away memories of every moment I was told I was less than, because each of those moments became the fuel that kept me steady when I was tempted to quit. If anything, the preparation was the only thing that gave me peace, because while Rachel lived in the highs and lows of my dad's approval, I was building something unshakable that couldn't be taken away by a smirk or a signature on the wrong line. So when he pushed those papers to her across the Thanksgiving table and looked at me with that smug grin, he thought he had locked me into my role once again, but what he didn't understand was that I had already written myself into a different ending. And while he saw a daughter sitting quietly in the corner, what he couldn't see was the years of groundwork already in motion, paperwork that had teeth, relationships that had backbone, and leverage that would not bend just because he raised his voice or lifted a glass to tradition. And that's why I didn't flinch, didn't beg, and didn't let the humiliation land the way it used to, because the truth is that by the time he thought he had silenced me, the game was already over, the pieces already locked in, and the next move wasn't his to make. The funny thing about moments that shift the balance of power in a family is that they never arrive with a drumroll or a flashing sign. They arrive in silence, in the middle of laughter, in the middle of someone raising a glass and pretending that everything is normal. And that is exactly how it was on that Thanksgiving night, because while my dad sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair like a king who had just secured his dynasty, and while Rachel kept folding and unfolding those property papers as though touching them made her more important, I was sitting there with something far more dangerous than a smile or a protest, something that had been waiting for years in my files. Something that turned all of his confidence into a gamble he did not even realize he had already lost. The lead-up to it was almost comical in its predictability, because once Rachel had the papers in her hands, she launched into this speech about responsibility and tradition, thanking Dad for trusting her and saying that she hoped to make him proud. And while the rest of the family nodded along and added little compliments as if they were watching a graduation ceremony, Dad turned his eyes back to me, smirking with that expression that wasn't just satisfaction, but was also a challenge, the look that said, "See, you don't matter, you never mattered, and I want you to feel it." That look would have crushed me years ago, but now it only fueled the quiet certainty that I had been carrying for so long, and when dessert was being passed around and everyone thought the night was winding down, I reached into my bag and pulled out a plain folder that looked completely unremarkable on the outside, but carried the kind of weight that could flatten the smug grin on his face in less than a minute. I didn't slam it down or make a scene, because the power wasn't in theatrics, it was in letting the silence do the work, so I slid it across the table toward him the same way he had slid his property papers toward Rachel. And when his hand touched the folder, his face shifted for the first time all evening, not because he knew what it was yet, but because he could tell that I wasn't bluffing, that I had come prepared, and when he opened it and started reading, the color drained from his face so quickly it was almost painful to watch. Inside was the legally binding agreement he had signed years earlier when he came to me for that short-term bailout, the agreement that stated clearly that any attempt to transfer or restructure certain assets, including the very property he had just handed to Rachel, would trigger conditions that required settlement of his debt to me in full, plus penalties, before any transfer could be recognized by the county. He looked up at me, and for once he didn't smirk, didn't lecture, didn't tell me I was exaggerating, because the words on those pages weren't my opinion, they were his signature. And there was no escaping the reality that his attempt to crown Rachel had just been intercepted by his own carelessness. Rachel, of course, snatched the papers from his hand, skimmed them with a confused look, and then demanded to know what this meant, and I kept my voice steady, almost calm, as I explained that the property could not be transferred cleanly because it was entangled in obligations that had not been met, obligations that had his name and signature all over them, and until those obligations were resolved, no one could claim ownership without running headfirst into legal walls that I had built brick by brick. The silence that followed was almost satisfying enough to stand on its own, because for the first time in my life my dad had no words to throw back at me, no insults or rationalizations, and Rachel had no stage to perform on, because the applause had been cut short by the reality that what looked like a triumph for her was actually nothing more than a dead end. I let that silence linger, because there was nothing sweeter than watching the power dynamic shift in real time, and, while part of me wanted to rub it in, I resisted, because the victory was sharper when delivered with restraint. I leaned back, took a sip of water, and finally let myself smile, not a wide grin, just enough to let him know that I had waited for this exact moment. That every slight and every dismissal had been stored away until the day I could show him that being invisible did not mean being powerless, it meant being underestimated. And being underestimated had given me the space to build something stronger than his approval. And as Rachel sat there clutching papers that now felt more like dead weight than inheritance, and as Dad stared at me with that hollow look of someone who finally realizes the game is not his to command, I simply said, "This is why I stayed quiet all these years." And though the table eventually broke into side conversations, uneasy laughter, and attempts to move on, the truth hung heavy in the room. The crown he had tried to place on Rachel's head had slipped off before it even touched her. And the smirk that had lived on his face for decades had finally disappeared, replaced by something that almost looked like fear. The thing about a room that has just watched a king lose his crown is that everyone suddenly remembers errands and dishes and pets that need feeding, so by the time I put my folder back in my bag, the table had thinned. The clink of plates covered the silence no one knew how to carry, and my dad, who never calls anyone after a scene because he prefers speeches to conversations, asked me to step into the hallway so we could handle this like family, which used to mean I would be told to swallow, if for the sake of peace. Yet this time it meant I opened my phone, pulled up the email thread from years back with the signed agreement and the recorded notice, and told him, in a voice that even surprised me with how steady it sounded, that we would handle it exactly like family by honoring what he signed when he wanted my help, and that the title company already had the memorandum on file, and that every path forward ran through a full settlement before anyone could wave papers around and pretend they were real. He tried the greatest hits, the tired melody of guilt and tradition and "don't do this to your sister," and he even threw in the generous offer to renegotiate if I would release the hold. As though I had staged a tantrum instead of executing a clause he had agreed to when he took my money and my trust, and I listened, because I wanted to remember this tone the next time anyone told me I was the unreasonable one. Then I told him that if he wanted to clear title, he could either satisfy the debt, plus the penalties we both initialed, or he could unwind the transfer and admit to Rachel that the coronation had been theater, and that I was perfectly fine with either choice, since I had built my life to survive without a parade. Rachel called that night with a voice that started in accusation and slid slowly into pleading when she realized I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't angry in the way she expected, and I told her something I had never said out loud before, that I didn't care about standing on the porch of that house with a set of keys or posing for a photograph next to a sign with our last name, that what I cared about was never again being erased while paying the bill for the erasure, and that if she wanted the property so badly she could convince Dad to honor his signature like any adult who gets to play with assets, and she hung up without saying goodbye, which felt familiar, but she called back the next morning and asked, in a voice I almost didn't recognize, whether there was a third option, something that didn't require me to win and her to lose, and I told her carefully that there was always a third option, but it started with Dad telling the truth on paper. The week that followed was a masterclass in how fast people can learn when the usual shortcuts are blocked, and by the time we met at a lawyer's office instead of a dining table, my dad had shifted from bluster to negotiation, trying to save face with language about misunderstanding and family spirit, while the attorney, who didn't care about our history or our mythology, slid a settlement packet across the desk that laid everything out with a simplicity even he couldn't dodge. And when he balked at the penalty, I let him sit in that discomfort until he remembered that I had not only recorded the lien, but, as a separate and very quiet step a year earlier, purchased the small outstanding note that sat against his operating company from a regional lender that wanted it off their books, which meant I now held both the teeth on the property and the leash on the entity that paid its taxes. And if he wanted to test me, I could pull either string. That was the final move I had kept to myself, not because I needed the drama of a reveal, but because leverage works best when it never has to be used, and in that room, with the papers laid out and the signatures waiting, he finally saw that I had taken the same independence he once threw at me like a punishment and turned it into a position he could not bulldoze, so he signed, and the transfer to Rachel was voided, and the debt was satisfied in full with interest and penalties, and a new agreement placed the property into a simple vehicle with clear rules that did not require his approval to respect me, with distributions tied to performance and a clause that prevented late-night coronations disguised as family tradition. I walked out of that office without a set of keys and without a victory speech, because I didn't need either, and when Rachel texted later to say she hated how it happened, but she understood why it had to, I sat with that message for a long time before answering, telling her that understanding is a start, but trust would take time, and that I wasn't interested in being her rival anymore because rivals fight for a spotlight and I was done performing, and she replied with one line that surprised me, that she never realized how heavy the spotlight felt until it burned her hands. As for my dad, he called a few days later with a stilted apology that sounded like a man reading a language he had never bothered to learn, and maybe that is all he has in him. Maybe he never becomes the version of a father I once begged the universe for. Yet the point of this was never to fix him, it was to fix me, to make sure the next time someone tried to write me out of my own life the ink would not stick, and when I think back to that smirk across the Thanksgiving table I feel something I have never felt before around him, not rage and not grief, but distance, the healthy kind that lets you see a man, not a god, and lets you protect yourself without asking permission. I will not pretend that settling the debt erased the history, and I will not pretend that a recorded document can teach a person humility. But I can say with certainty that when a woman who has been underestimated for years finally plays the only game that ever mattered and wins without shouting, the lesson tends to linger. And if you are wondering whether I still have something else tucked away in a folder for the day another smirk appears, the answer is that the note I bought from the lender came with options, and options do not expire as quickly as pride, so the table may change and the speeches may return, yet the balance has shifted for good, and that is enough for me.